Let me introduce her daughter, the great-great-great-great. I gotta make sure I get those number of greats correct there. Granddaughter, three, great-great-great-granddaughter of Sir William Herschel, Julia Harwich.
Oh,
Julia?
she's four.
She's four, okay. Thank you, Julia, for being here with us this evening. We especially appreciate your being a part of this. And our very special guest this evening is the great-great-great, I got that one right, granddaughter of Sir William Herschel, a direct descendant of the male line. She has become the spokesperson for the Herschel family, has given her talk internationally on the Herschel family. She is also the County Councilor in Lincolnshire, England. Please help me welcome Ms. Charlotte Herschel Farquharson to speak to us this evening on the Herschel family. Thank you for being here.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am astonished to be here because 3 weeks ago it wasn't even an idea on the horizon. But here, now I'm in the campus Science Auditorium, and you're all here, and we're going to talk about the Herschels as a family. There is not one word about astronomy except the word astronomy in this, because I'm not an astronomer, or a scientist, or a physicist, or anything clever like that. This talk came about because I was asked about 5 years ago to go out to Japan, as big a surprise as coming to Jacksonville, to give a talk on the Herschel family for the Herschel Society in Japan, because it was their 20th anniversary. And they're a very lively little astronomical society. And as I used to live in Hong Kong, I thought, well, I can have a couple of weeks in Hong Kong, and then I can go to Japan, and they can push me around there, and I'll give the talk, and then I'll go to Los Angeles and see my son, and then I'll go to Rochester and see my sister, and in other words, I can circumnavigate the globe. And so I gave this talk in most of these places, and here we are, to my intense surprise, in Jacksonville. And why here? Because you have a Herschel Street in Jacksonville. And Janet, Germany here, has been redeveloping a property there, which is unique. I hope you'll all go to see it. And on Sunday, it's going to be dedicated. It's been named, in a rather roundabout way, after Caroline Herschel. And it's called the Stella Lina, and I think that's a very pretty name, and Stella being a star, of course, and Lina was William Herschel's pet name for Caroline. And she's put the two ideas together and dedicated her house to little Caroline. Well, it all comes about because I am the great-granddaughter of William Herschel. And of course the great-great-granddaughter of John Herschel, and the great-granddaughter of another one, William James, who you may not have heard about, but who has had a big impact on the world in general. And as we go through and into space, so I'm finding out that this family, from which I'm descended, is considered to be pretty important. When I was a little girl, we didn't really mention it much. So, they made a big contribution to a wide spectrum of human knowledge. And there were 5 of them. Now, I've got to get used to this. There was William, the great William. And his sister Caroline, we've all heard of her. Isn't this clever? And then his son John. Oh yes, good, it works. And 2 of his grandsons, William James, there he is, and Alexander, a dyspeptic sort of man. The origin of the family is German, of course. Herschel's a German name. And they came from the area around Dresden. And the previous generations had been manual workers, employed as gardeners, and heavy workmen and brewers' draymen. But William's father, his name was Isaac, he developed a talent for playing the violin. And he learned to play it sufficiently well to move to Hanover. And there he joined the Hanoverian Foot Guards, and he embarked on a shotgun marriage and we know it was shotgun, to a woman called Anna Moritzen. There's 6 months between the marriage and the birth of the first child. Now, Anna seems to have been rather a scolding and bad-tempered woman, but I think she doesn't deserve that reputation too much. She was certainly semi-literate, but she brought into this world 10 children, 4 of whom died in infancy from smallpox and nasty things like that. Isaac, William's father, was a very decent and very intelligent man, and he became unusually involved in the intellectual upbringing of his children. They remembered being gathered around a barrel of water, nice and still, to watch the eclipse of the moon. I thought that was really quite clever. This was in the days when long before telescopes were any good. And he showed his children this eclipse of the moon in the water. No, it was the sun, sorry, because it would be too bright otherwise. And it was an early lesson in astronomy for William. The father, Isaac, I've put this up here for you. Can you see it? To help you with the family tree and the names that I'm talking about. He died after several debilitating strokes, and he's buried in the Gartenkirchhof in Hanover. And the grave is this one, sticking up. That's Caroline's grave down below. And the day we went there, we nearly died of heat. It was unbelievably hot. And it's actually very lucky that this grave has survived at all, because the church and the churchyard is a matter of 200, 300 yards from the total devastation which the Allies visited on Hanover during the war. Unbelievably just flattened. I couldn't believe it when I saw the models. Now, Isaac's 6 surviving children were Sophia, the eldest, and she married a foul-tempered musician called Jacob Griesbach. And she had a large family of boys with him, and they all became musicians at the court at Windsor under George III, and because the family was musical. And there are very interesting records kept at Windsor Castle about their work, and George III, who you know about from American history and the loss of the American colonies, he grumbled that he was entirely too much surrounded by Herschels, because of course they were William Herschel's nephews, these boys. The second child was a son, and he was also called Jacob, and he was a musician as well. And he was feckless and he was self-serving, and his death, age 58, was a bit mysterious because he was found in a field. He'd been garroted, so that wasn't too nice. But judging by what I know of him from what I've read, he deserved it. William was born in 1738, on the 15th of November. And he was the third child, and of course I'll have to deal with him later on. There was another son, Alexander, who also became a musician, and he eventually became William's right-hand man in the making of telescopes and in helping with musical work in Bath. And he lived in England until 1816. The great Caroline, little Caroline, was the 5th child, and her life, as you all know, became so intertwined with William Herschel so that it's hard to separate them. There was another boy who was the baby of the family. His name was Dietrich. And aside from his work as a musician, he had a hobby, entomology. And it's curious to realize that one man's hobby can be another man's help, because he taught William how to catalogue the specimens, and William diverted this method of cataloguing into his cataloguing of the stars. So these 6 children were brought up against a background of continual war. Europe at that time was just a whole lot of little dukedoms, kingdoms, princedoms, and that sort of thing. They weren't well off, certainly weren't well off, but they didn't go short of food, clothing, or the best education that their father could manage for them. Wrong picture. What do I do now? Go back, let's see what we get. Oh well. I'll go back to William. He was born on November the 15th, 1738. And he turned out to be the most intelligent of Isaac's surviving children. And it was Isaac who woke William's intellectual life with active encouragement of the exploration of the heavens, philosophy, science, mathematics, language, and astronomy. He had, these were simple people, and he had a fluent knowledge of French, and he wrote many of his early letters in French, and he wrote them very well too. He was capable in Latin, and he was also capable in Italian, and of course he spoke German fluently, and he spoke English like an Englishman. Probably because he had a musical ear. He came to England as an oboist with the Hanoverian Foot Guards on a short secondment when he was 17. And on his return to Hanover, he found himself in the thick of the Battle of Hastenbach and spent a day sheltering in a flooded ditch while the cannonballs flew over his head. And his father didn't think much of that and encouraged him to leave the Foot Guards. Have we got this picture?
That is actually your next slide.
Is it? Oh,
yes,
right.
ma'am. There
There it is. Good. There's brilliant. Judging by this miniature, he was quite good looking. Quite good looking. And I like to allow myself the fancy that I've inherited his nose. And I've got to put my glasses back on. His character, William's character, seems to have been very nice. He had charm, he was kind and thoughtful, he was practical, methodical, curious, imaginative, and self-disciplined, and extremely hard-working. But he also had a spasmodic and very sharp temper. He was a much better than average musician, and he was skilled on several instruments. And he could compose quite pleasing music. You've heard some of it when it was required. He kept notes and he kept journals about his activities throughout his life. And John did the same. His son John did the same. And it's thanks to this habit of keeping notes and keeping documents that we know so much about the early lives of the Herschels. In fact, it makes it very difficult to find out what, there's more to leave out than what to leave out rather than what to put in. His first employment when he got back to England in 1857 was as a copier of music scores. That's a very humble job. And, but he fairly soon found work playing in orchestras and bands. He had ambition even then, and that ambition was to become famous as a composer. And his work took him all over England, especially to the north. And as he rode his horse, he read books about mathematics, and he once lost concentration to such an extent that he fell off, and another time he fell asleep in the saddle, and the horse plodded on unaware. But for a young man, it was a lonely and a very vagrant life. And it was enjoyable because he was meeting people of influence and stature in England and becoming friends with them. They lasted for much of his life. But it was desolate because of the lack of home and family. Eventually, he settled in Leeds and worked as an organist there. And then another job came up with a modern organ in Halifax. Prior to this, church music had been played on wind instruments and violins, or string instruments. And the organ was a very new invention, so he was keen to get the job in Halifax. And he got it because he cheated. He took some lumps of lead and put them on one or other of the pedals, and it augmented the sound of the organ and gave it a terrific boom, and he got the job. Didn't last long, because he then heard about a job in Bath, in the west of England, as a position as music master at the Octagon Chapel. And there's the organ at the Octagon Chapel. It's now been demolished completely, but we do have a few of the pipes at Herschel House in Bath, which is a miracle. And the building is used as a community centre. It's right in the middle of Bath. Now, back in 1766, which is when William arrived in Bath, it was a little town that had expanded very rapidly from being the watering place used by the Romans because it had hot springs, to becoming the premier spa and holiday place in the United Kingdom. And the reason for this was, of course, all those wars going on in Europe. People weren't travelling, but they still wanted to take the waters for their health. And as a spa, Bath needed a musical director, and so William, who obviously wasn't averse to putting himself forward, applied for the job, and he got it. And his busy life became hectic, but not too busy to have his name linked with several pretty young women, especially a widow called Mrs. Colebrook. And I'm thankful to say that Caroline saw her off. It's fascinating to go into a town where, on the Pulteney Bridge, on such and such a date, I know that William was there flirting with a girl, you know, and you go through a town and you think, this is extraordinary. This slide shows one of the advertisements and a ticket for one of William's concerts, in which Caroline featured as the lead singer. And within 3 years of his arrival in Bath, William's annual income was £316. And by 1771, it had risen to about £400. And doing the translations, it meant, and without tax, it meant that he was earning between £35,000 and £40,000 a year, which even today is considered to be quite a good income. Oh, change. Thank you. Here's some views of Bath. These are photographs of buildings in Bath that William would have known. We haven't got a picture of this. I'll do another one quickly. No. Yes, this is New King Street in Bath. And this is Herschel House here. And there's a picture of his front door. He actually lived in many different establishments in Bath, but it's this one where he happened to become famous. So it's all over Bath that he lived and worked and eventually became an astronomer. William had had the insight to realize that his little sister Caroline was deeply depressed back in Hanover. She was becoming the household drudge, and she had no prospect of marriage because she had had typhus as a little girl and smallpox, all in the same short period of time. So her stature was tiny. She was about 4'8" tall, and her skin was very, very badly damaged by smallpox. One of her eyes drooped because of the damage that smallpox had done. And so her chances of marriage were very slight. And her mother never let her forget the chances of marriage were slight. And William decided that he had to get Caroline out of Hanover, and he paid, Caroline, yes, and he paid for a servant back in Hanover to replace Caroline. And he went out to Germany and collected Caroline to bring her back to England. They had a wonderful journey because he was teaching her basic astronomy, just a sort of hobby at that time, from the carriage that was travelling right the way across Europe. It's a journey in those days that took 2 weeks. And then they got on the boat, and there was a huge storm, and instead of arriving in London, they arrived right up, halfway up England, and then had to get a carriage to go down to London, and the carriage overturned and threw them into a ditch. In fact, ditches seem to feature quite a lot in William's life. They had to wade ashore because the boatman wasn't prepared to see to his side of the bargain, so it was quite an adventurous journey. And Caroline was reasonably clever. She learnt English quite quickly, and she took over the entire running of the busy Herschel household. They shared it with other people to help with the rent, but she was ill at ease with his friends, and she knew herself to be too forthright and unpretentious. Throughout her life, she found it really difficult to make friends, and her lonely soul attached itself to William, and from this time on, her life was lived entirely with his well-being her foremost concern. William had come to England right at the beginning of what became the Industrial Revolution. And all over the country, the men involved were forming themselves into societies which met to discuss the problems created by their work and their ambitions. It was the British who really turned this world into the modern world we know today. So William joined one of these societies in Bath, and he so found his mind being further open to new ideas and discoveries. This engraving was actually made in 1862 as a homage to the men who contributed so much to England in the previous 100 years. You can see William sitting behind the globe here. And by that time he was rather fat. And sitting behind, next to him is his great friend Neville Maskelyne, who was the Astronomer Royal. And the short man standing behind William, I think he's wearing spectacles, is Peter Dolland, who was an optician and lens maker, and he founded a company back in the late 1760, 1770, and this company, Dolland and Aitchison, is still in existence as an optician in England. So quite interesting the length that history goes back. Left of Maskelyne, this man, is Edward Jenner. Do you know what he did? Hands up.
Vaccination.
Thank you. He developed vaccination against smallpox. Also in the picture is James Watt, who harnessed steam as a source of power. There are 56 or 58 men in this engraving who made enormous contributions to modern thought and modern technology. It was among these men that William made his friends. So his mind was being opened up continually and more. William had needed to continue with the study of mathematics and harmonics as part of his musical work. Mathematics and music go together, I'm told. And he moved on through the study of mathematics to the study of optics. And that led him into a new and exciting discipline. And in May 1773, he noted in his journal that he had bought a book of astronomy and one of astronomical tables. And from that followed the necessity to supply himself with instruments to pursue the new hobby. And he bought the stock of an optician who was going out of business and retiring. And being a practical man, I don't know how he did it, he set about making his own telescopes. And he managed to get his brothers and his Caroline involved in the work, and the whole house was turned over to be a workshop for the making of telescopes. And the polishing of mirrors and the pouring of the metals to make the mirrors. If you ever go to New King Street in Bath, you'll see the tiny space in which they did a lot of this work. And this is your project. I'll read from this. It was a huge learning curve as well as being dangerous, because once the mould for a mirror, which was lined with powdered horse dung, that's the bit that's worrying us, it cracked, and the metal poured all over the floor, so hot it cracked the flagstones. They broke into smithereens and flew like missiles all over this tiny room, and they had to dive and roll out of the back door to avoid it. And then they had the problem of the set metal being in and among all the flagstones. It nearly killed them. And I can only ask you to imagine the